June 15, 1944. Saipan, the heart of the Mariana Islands. The morning air was heavy with salt and silence. Mist rose from the jungle slopes as the first light of dawn brushed across the ridges overlooking the sea. Japanese soldiers, weary and hollow-eyed, stood along the cliffs, rifles slung, binoculars trembling in their hands. At first, it looked like a storm forming beyond the horizon, a faint smudge of darkness spreading across the silver-blue Pacific. But the line did not move like clouds. It grew wider, steadier, deeper. And then, in the stillness, came the low vibration, a deep, rhythmic hum carried through the earth itself. One soldier lowered his glasses. Another whispered a prayer. Across the horizon, an armada was rising, hundreds of ships stretching as far as the eye could see. Carriers, battleships, transports, a moving wall of steel. The sea itself seemed to advance toward them. No words were spoken, no orders shouted, only silence, a silence heavier than fear, because at that moment, every man on that ridge understood. The war had reached their shore, and it would not leave. By mid-1944, the Pacific had become an ocean of defeat for Imperial Japan. What once seemed like an empire of islands stretching from Manchuria to New Guinea was shrinking by the month. The tide that had surged outward after Pearl Harbor was now receding under relentless American pressure. 2 years earlier, the Japanese had believed in the strength of the rising sun. Swift victories at Singapore, the Philippines, and the Dutch East Indies had carved out what Tokyo proudly called the Greater East Asia, co-prosperity sphere. But victories bought with surprise and courage could not stand against an enemy whose factories never slept. From the frozen Aleutians to the steaming jungles of the Solomons, Japan's defensive perimeter was collapsing. The American strategy, island hopping, was ruthless in its precision. It bypassed strongholds, cut supply lines, and reduced proud garrisons to silence. Every island taken became a forward base. Every airstrip extended America's reach closer to Japan itself. By early 1944, the Pacific was no longer contested. It was dominated. The U.S. Navy had evolved into an unstoppable machine. Task forces of carriers, escort ships, and submarines working in perfect synchronization. The industrial weight behind them was unimaginable. American shipyards were launching a new vessel every few days. Factories in Detroit, Seattle, and Philadelphia produced aircraft faster than Japan could replace its pilots. Meanwhile, Japan's war economy was suffocating. Oil from Borneo struggled to reach the home islands. Convoys were harassed by U.S. submarines lurking along sea lanes. Out of every 10 Japanese merchant ships that left port, barely 6 would return. Yet in Tokyo, pride and tradition prevented retreat. To abandon a single island was to abandon honor. So garrisons were told to hold to the last man. On Saipan, that meant nearly 30,000 Japanese troops. Infantrymen, engineers, and naval personnel, cut off from meaningful resupply, armed with dwindling ammunition and no air cover. They were led by Lieutenant General Yoshitsugu Saito and Vice Admiral Chuichi Nagamo, the same admiral who had once commanded the carriers that attacked Pearl Harbor. Now, Nagumo's war was ending not on the bridge of a carrier, but inside a concrete bunker. Saipan was more than a speck of coral and jungle. It was strategic ground, a dagger pointed at the heart of the Japanese Empire. If the Americans captured it, their new B-29 bombers could strike Tokyo directly from its airfields. For the United States, this was the next step toward ending the war. For Japan, it was the line that could never be crossed. By the end of May 1944, reconnaissance flights from U.S. submarines and aircraft confirmed Saipan's heavy fortifications. Tunnels, pillboxes, artillery emplacements hidden among caves and cliffs. The defenders were exhausted, but determined. Still, the Japanese High Command clung to a fading hope. They believed that the Imperial Navy, the combined fleet, would soon come to the island's rescue, that somehow in one decisive battle, they could destroy the American invasion fleet and restore balance to the Pacific. But the truth was far darker. The once proud fleet that had terrorized the Pacific in 1941 was now a shell of its former self. Aircraft carriers lacked trained pilots. Fuel shortages limited even basic maneuvers. While American sailors trained daily in coordinated air-sea tactics, many Japanese ships sat idle, conserving fuel for a battle that could never be won. On the islands themselves, soldiers endured more than the enemy. They faced hunger, disease, and silence. Their radio contact with Tokyo grew faint, sometimes gone for weeks. Supplies arrived rarely. A few crates dropped by submarines, sometimes lost to the sea. The tropical heat rotted food, rusted weapons, and wore down even the strongest spirits. Yet through all of it, one belief kept them still: the Emperor's cause. To die for him was not tragedy. It was the only honorable end. As the summer of 1944 began, distant thunder rolled across the Pacific. The Americans had taken the Marshall Islands and were now gathering in the hundreds around Eniwetok and Kwajalein, staging grounds for a blow that would strike deep into Japan's defense zone. Every Japanese officer on Saipan knew it was coming. They just did not know when, and so each morning soldiers stood on the ridges and watched the empty horizon, praying that the silence would last one more day. That silence would soon break. In the summer of 1944, the Pacific Ocean became a highway of war. From Hawaii to the Central Pacific, American convoys began to move. A living, mechanical procession of power unlike anything the world had ever seen. Every ship, every crate, every gallon of fuel represented a triumph of organization and will. The operation was codenamed Forager, the invasion of the Mariana Islands. Its goal was simple in words, but colossal in scale: to seize Saipan, Tinian, and Guam, and from there, open a direct aerial path to the Japanese homeland. For General Holland M. Smith, commanding the V Amphibious Corps, and Admiral Raymond Spruance, leading the Fifth Fleet, Forager would test every lesson learned since Guadalcanal. The assault force included more than 500 ships, among them 15 aircraft carriers, 7 battleships, 11 cruisers, and over 100 destroyers. Behind them trailed convoys of transports, oilers, repair ships, and hospital vessels. Each carried men and machines destined for the beaches of Saipan. More than 127,000 troops, Marines and Army infantry, were to land. The scale of logistics was staggering. Over 1.8 million rounds of ammunition, 7,000 vehicles, 4,000 tons of food, and 9 million gallons of fuel. And behind those numbers stood something far greater: industrial certainty. In the skies above the Pacific, long-range bombers and reconnaissance planes charted weather patterns and enemy positions with precision unthinkable in 1941. Beneath the waves, submarines patrolled routes to ensure no Japanese reinforcements could arrive undetected. On distant islands like Majuro and Pearl Harbor, mobile repair depots and floating docks prepared for continuous warfare without pause. The United States had mastered the art of movement on an oceanic scale. At the heart of it all was a simple truth: logistics had become the new weapon. Every crate of rations, every drum of gasoline, every radio spare part meant one more day of strength. Japan, strangled by blockade, could not match it. To the Japanese soldiers still clinging to their island outposts, the sound of engines over the sea was once a source of pride, proof of their empire's reach. Now, it was a sound that belonged to the enemy. American ships advanced in perfect rhythm. From aerial scouts to naval planners, every movement was timed to the minute. The horizon stretched not as a line, but as a living wall. Waves of steel cutting across the Pacific with mathematical precision. In contrast, Japanese reconnaissance aircraft flew on borrowed time. Their pilots faced impossible odds, outdated planes, limited fuel, and the constant threat of American carrier fighters. Many never returned. Reports reaching Tokyo were vague, delayed, or incomplete. Inside Imperial headquarters, senior officers debated how to respond. Admiral Soemu Toyoda, newly appointed commander-in-chief of the combined fleet, believed the Marianas must not fall. For if they did, Japan's heartland would lie within reach of enemy bombers. He ordered Operation Eigo, a desperate naval counteroffensive that would gather the last strength of the Imperial Navy for a single decisive battle. But Toyoda's faith in the decisive battle was based on a world that no longer existed, American. Intelligence had already intercepted much of the Japanese planning. Admiral Spruance knew the enemy fleet would come, and he prepared to destroy it. While Japan hoped to lure the Americans into a trap, the U.S. Navy was preparing to end the war's middle act. As the massive convoys departed Pearl Harbor in late May 1944, sailors crowded the decks, watching the Hawaiian coastline fade. Their ships sailed in endless formation, row upon row of hulls, carriers stretching across the horizon, destroyers cutting through the waves like hounds before a hunt. To the human eye, it was a moving continent. Weeks later, that continent appeared on the edge of the Japanese world. For the men waiting on Saipan's cliffs, there had been rumors, stories of immense convoys seen by submarines, whispers of fleets that blotted out the sun. Few believed it. Most could not imagine it. Then, one morning, the sea itself began to darken. At first, it was distant thunder, the sound of thousands of engines echoing across the Pacific. Then came the shapes, countless silhouettes rising over the curve of the world. Carriers, transports, destroyers, tankers, each one trailing smoke against the dawn. The endless convoy had arrived. It was more than an invasion force. It was the physical manifestation of America's industrial soul, the sum of every factory worker, every welder, every farmer and engineer. A moving symbol of inevitability, and as it approached, the Japanese soldiers who saw it understood what no propaganda could deny. They were witnessing not just the enemy's fleet, but the end of their own. That horizon of steel and smoke would soon erupt into fire. For months, Saipan had been a prison without bars. The Japanese soldiers stationed there, infantrymen of the 43rd Division, naval gunners, construction crews, and airfield workers, lived under the constant echo of distant war. Radio updates from Tokyo grew shorter and more hollow with each passing week. Victory had become a word used only in speeches. They dug trenches that filled with rainwater, carved caves into cliff sides, and planted mines along beaches they knew the enemy would one day reach. But beneath the routine of duty was something unspoken: resignation. To the outside world, they were the defenders of the empire. To themselves, they were witnesses to its slow death. Each man carried his own burden: letters from home that would never be answered, a family name he would never see again. Some kept photographs of wives and children sealed in oilcloth. Others carried only their service flags, folded into neat triangles, meant to be returned to their mothers if they fell. When the horizon filled with the silhouettes of American ships, many did not speak. They simply stood and watched. Some cried quietly, not from fear, but from the recognition of something vast, the sheer, crushing inevitability of what was coming. They had been taught that the spirit of Japan could overcome any material odds. But here before them was material power beyond comprehension. And for the first time, that belief faltered. General Yoshitsugu Saito's defenses on Saipan reflected both determination and desperation. The island's 23-kilometer length was fortified in layers, coastal artillery guarding every likely landing zone, interlocking machine gun nests, and hidden tunnels linking command posts to forward positions. Japanese engineers had spent months carving out what they hoped would be a defensive maze. Every hill, every ridge, every patch of jungle was turned into a potential kill zone. The plan was simple in theory: bleed the invaders until the counterattack from the sea arrived. But the theory was built on a myth. The Imperial Navy that was supposed to come to their aid was already crippled. The pilots who once flew for Nagumo's carriers were gone, lost over Midway, Guadalcanal, and the Philippine Sea. When the Americans came, Saipan's garrison would stand alone. The defensive doctrine called for annihilating the enemy at the beaches. Artillery zeroed in on the shallow coral reefs where landing craft would slow down. Snipers were ordered to hold their fire until the last moment. Even medical stations were converted into bunkers. But beneath the discipline was fear, not of death, but of being forgotten. Many officers knew the battle's outcome before it began. Their mission was not victory, it was delay. To the Japanese command, each island was a stone in a wall meant to buy time for the homeland to prepare. To the men who would die there, it was simply their final post. And when the endless convoy appeared, their tactical diagrams and firing grids felt meaningless. The sea was filled with more targets than they could count. No gun could stop what was coming. To the Americans, the invasion fleet represented not arrogance, but calculation. Each vessel was a moving part of a vast mechanism, precise, redundant, and overwhelming. Carriers like the USS Enterprise and USS Hornet launched fighter patrols before dawn. Battleships, such as Pennsylvania and California, prepared their massive guns for preliminary bombardment. Tank landing ships, LSTs, were packed with Sherman tanks, bulldozers, and trucks. Smaller Higgins boats would ferry the first waves of Marines through the surf. Everything was scheduled. Every unit had its role. The distance between ships, the timing of bombardments, even the order of unloading supplies was plotted with mathematical discipline. It was a choreography of war. Behind it stood the invisible hand of American industry. Assembly lines in California producing aircraft faster than they could be destroyed, shipyards on both coasts running day and night. While Japan hand-forged its weapons in dwindling workshops, the United States mass-produced the tools of victory on an industrial scale that defied imagination. The convoy itself was more than a fleet. It was a demonstration of what modern warfare had become. Logistics was no longer the background of battle. It was the battle. Every gallon of oil burned by a battleship, every crate of food consumed by a Marine, every radio battery used on shore. All of it had been calculated, packed, shipped, and replaced. And this was what the Japanese soldiers saw when they looked across the water. Not merely ships, but a civilization in motion. Mechanical, relentless, and unending. As the convoys approached Saipan, radar operators tracked every wave, and aerial scouts confirmed there was no Japanese fleet in range. The Pacific, once the Empire's proud domain, now belonged to the enemy. From horizon to horizon, the ocean shimmered with the reflection of metal and sunlight, the future bearing down on the past. The soldiers watching from the cliffs did not know the full scale of what they faced, but they felt it, like a weight pressing down on their chests. They would soon discover what that power could do when it unleashed its fire. At sea and on land, leadership defined the coming storm. But in 1944, Japanese and American commanders lived in different realities. In Tokyo, Admiral Soemu Toyoda, commander-in-chief of the combined fleet, studied maps with a grim composure. His fleet was exhausted, his air arm crippled, yet his belief in the decisive battle remained unbroken. To him, honor demanded that Japan fight not for survival, but for destiny. Toyota's Operation Ego was a last gamble, a plan to lure the U.S. fleet into the Central Pacific and destroy it in one grand encounter, echoing the spirit of Tsushima in 1905. The plan assumed that courage and divine fate could overcome logistics and numbers. But far out on the ocean, his counterpart, Admiral Raymond Spruance, commanded with a different philosophy. Spruance was calm, methodical, and utterly unsentimental. He believed in precision, not passion. His Fifth Fleet was a living network. Aircraft carriers scouting hundreds of miles ahead, battleships ready to bombard, submarines closing Japan's lifelines. Spruance didn't seek glory. He sought results. Between these two men lay the difference between 19th-century tradition and 20th-century modernity. Toyota placed faith in spirit. Spruance placed faith in systems. And when the convoys appeared on the horizon, it was that contrast, the emotional versus the mechanical, that would define what happened next. For the Japanese soldier, surrender was unthinkable. From childhood, he had been taught the code of Bushido, the way of the warrior. To die for the emperor was not tragedy. It was fulfillment. Defeat, on the other hand, was shame eternal. This belief gave Japanese units incredible endurance, but it also blinded them to the scale of their enemy's power. Propaganda told them Americans were soft, indulgent, incapable of sacrifice. But the sight of that endless convoy shattered the illusion. Men who had marched through China and fought in the jungles of the Solomons now felt something deeper than fear: insignificance. Their rifles, their courage, even their faith seemed small against the mechanical vastness rolling toward them. And yet, even as tears welled in their eyes, they did not break discipline. Orders remained orders. They cleaned their weapons, checked ammunition, and prepared positions as they had been trained to. To cry was not weakness, it was acknowledgement. Each man understood that his death would no longer change the course of the war. But still, he would fight. Some prayed for the fleet to arrive, the mythic salvation from Tokyo. Others simply stared at the horizon and whispered to themselves. In their silence, there was dignity. But there was also realization. They were fighting not to defend Japan's empire, but to buy it a few more months of illusion. Aboard the American ships, the mood was very different, but not entirely triumphant. For many young sailors and Marines, the sheer scale of the fleet was overwhelming. Standing on the decks of carriers or destroyers, they watched the convoy stretch beyond sight, a forest of masts and smokestacks under the Pacific sun. Some compared it to the cities they had left behind, floating skylines of steel. Few among them fully grasped what it meant to the enemy. For weeks, they had trained, loaded, and prepared without seeing a single Japanese soldier. They knew the enemy's reputation for fanatic resistance, but they could not imagine the isolation and despair of those waiting on the islands ahead. To the Americans, the convoy was progress, proof that the tide had turned, that technology and production had made victory inevitable. But beneath the surface, some sailors felt uneasy. They had seen what war did to men at Tarawa and Kwajalein. They knew that every crate unloaded would soon translate into lives lost on the beaches. On the flag bridge of the USS Indianapolis, officers scanned the horizon with binoculars. The formation was flawless. Dozens of carriers, hundreds of escorts, a vast mechanical ballet moving toward history. Far to the west, Japanese observers watched the same horizon and saw the end of their world. Two realities existed in the same moment, one of power, one of helplessness, and between them stretched the Pacific, soon to be consumed by fire and iron. The American convoy continued forward in perfect rhythm, guided by radar and precision charts. The Japanese defenders waited, staring into the growing shadow that covered the sea. Within days, those shadows would erupt into flame, and the world would witness one of the most one-sided clashes in naval history. The silence of the soldiers on Saipan would be broken by the thunder of the Battle of the Philippine Sea. The day the eyewitness Japanese Empire's fate was sealed. June 13, 1944, 2 days before the American landings on Saipan. At dawn, the sky was pale and still. The jungle canopy swayed lightly in the sea breeze. Japanese sentries stood along the coastal ridges, scanning the horizon as they had every morning. But this time, the horizon did not shimmer with the usual calm. It trembled. A deep rumble, distant but growing, rolled through the earth. Within minutes, the first shapes appeared: battleships, cruisers, and destroyers cutting through the blue expanse, their wakes trailing white scars across the water. The endless convoy had arrived in full. From observation posts, Japanese officers shouted bearings and estimates. Over 100 vessels. No, more. Far more. Telephones rang in underground bunkers. General Saito's staff began to mark the sea chart, but the numbers were meaningless. Every time they looked again through their binoculars, the line of ships had grown longer. And then the thunder began. At precisely 0500 hours, the first salvos erupted from the sea. Shells the size of motorcycles screamed across the sky, leaving trails of smoke before slamming into the coastline. The ground convulsed. Caves collapsed. Trees disappeared in bursts of flame. The American naval bombardment of Saipan had begun, and it would last for 2 unbroken days. To the soldiers trapped beneath the barrage, it felt as if the island itself was being erased. The air was thick with the smell of cordite and burning earth. Communication lines were severed almost instantly. Runners who tried to cross open ground were torn apart by shrapnel. In the bunkers near Garapan and Charan Kanoa, Japanese gunners clung to their artillery, waiting for the chance to fire back. But their targets were invisible. The sea was hidden behind a wall of smoke and dust. Every few minutes, another wave of explosions walked inland. Battleships like the USS Tennessee, California, and Idaho fired continuously, their guns turning the jungle into a furnace. Cruisers pounded coastal batteries, while destroyers closed in to silence anything that dared respond. In the sky above, American carrier aircraft circled like hawks, strafing gun positions and bombing command posts. For the defenders, there was no escape, neither in the air nor under the ground. General Saito ordered all units to hold position. The Emperor expects every man to fight where he stands. But many never even reached their assigned posts. From the cliffs above the beaches, surviving soldiers watched as the sea flickered with flame. Ships moved methodically, shelling, shifting, shelling again. Landing craft were lowered in the distance, hundreds of them, filled with men who would soon storm the beaches. For the first time, Japanese officers began to speak the unthinkable, that no amount of courage could withstand such firepower. Inside his bunker, Vice Admiral Chuichi Nagumo, the man who had once commanded the attack on Pearl Harbor, sat in silence. He listened to the same sound he had once unleashed on others, the unending roar of naval guns. But now he was on the receiving end. It was as if the war had turned back upon him. By the end of the first day, nearly every coastal defense gun had been destroyed or buried. Artillery units were down to a handful of shells. Hospitals overflowed with wounded, but medical supplies were nearly gone. Night brought no relief. The bombardment continued in intervals, flares, explosions, and the metallic rhythm of ships repositioning offshore. The Japanese defenders could see the flashes across the horizon like distant lightning. To some, it looked like the wrath of gods. To others, it was simply the inevitable price of defiance. By June 15th, when the first landing craft began to approach, the beaches of Saipan were nothing but shattered coral and smoke. The defenders, deafened and dazed, emerged from caves and trenches, their uniforms blackened by soot. They had survived 2 days of the most concentrated naval gunfire ever unleashed in the Pacific War. But the true storm, the human assault, was only just beginning. As the Marines closed in, American battleships shifted their fire inland, creating a curtain of explosions that crawled forward in sync with the invasion. Landing craft rammed through surf and coral, machine gun fire chattering from their bows. Japanese soldiers braced themselves behind ruined defenses, eyes fixed on the rising shapes of men in olive drab wading toward them. For the Americans, it was another step in a long campaign. For the Japanese, it was the moment when every prayer met reality. From the ridge above the beach, one soldier whispered to another, "They are endless." The convoy, once distant on the horizon, now filled the world before them. Steel, smoke, and thunder had come ashore. June 15th, 1944, the beaches of Saipan. The sea was still burning when the first American landing craft hit the sand. The 2nd and 4th Marine Divisions surged forward under the cover of naval fire. The air was thick with smoke, sand, and the smell of cordite. Machine gun rounds tore through the surf as men leapt from their Higgins boats into waist-deep water. The Japanese defenders, emerging from half-collapsed bunkers, opened fire with everything they had left. Mortars, rifles, even knee-mounted grenade launchers. The first waves of Marines were cut down within meters of shore. But they kept coming. The line of landing craft was endless, wave after wave, each bringing hundreds more men, tanks, and supplies. Within an hour, American armor began crawling up the beach, flamethrowers hissing to life. On the cliffs above Kanoa, Japanese officers watched in disbelief. Their artillery had been silenced, their communications cut. The beaches were supposed to be impregnable. Instead, they were swallowed by a tide of soldiers in green. By midday, the Marines had carved out a beachhead nearly 2 miles wide. They fought yard by yard through sugarcane fields and coral ridges under relentless sniper fire. In the villages beyond the coast, civilians hid in caves, terrified of both armies. The Japanese military had warned them that the Americans would show no mercy. Mothers clutched children in the dark, listening to the thunder move closer. By nightfall, Saipan had become a single continuous battlefield. The Japanese 43rd Infantry Regiment counterattacked after sunset, screaming, "Banzai!" as they charged through smoke and shell fire. Marines fired until their barrels glowed red. When ammunition ran low, they fought hand to hand. Bayonets, knives, even entrenching tools. The night was a blur of chaos and screams. When dawn broke, the fields were littered with bodies. Entire companies of Japanese soldiers, cut down in the open. General Yoshitsugu Saito, in his underground command post, received the first casualty reports. Thousands dead in a single night. But his response was calm. "It is good," he said. "They died for the emperor." He ordered his men to fight to the last man. No surrender, no retreat. To the Americans advancing inland, it felt less like battle and more like extermination. Japanese soldiers fought from caves, tunnels, and hidden bunkers. Every ridge, every ravine became a death trap. Flamethrowers became the weapon of choice. Marines would blast liquid fire into cave mouths, followed by demolition charges. The explosions shook the ground. Smoke poured from the mountainsides. Inside those caves, hundreds of defenders burned or suffocated. It was not war, it was eradication. On June 18th, after 3 days of unbroken fighting, The Marines captured Aslito Airfield, soon renamed Islay Field. American engineers began extending runways before the battle was even over. It was a clear sign. Saipan was not just a victory. It was a step toward Japan itself. For the defenders, it was a death sentence. General Saito sent one last message to Tokyo. "We are determined to die beautifully in battle." By late June, Japanese command was collapsing. Vice Admiral Nagumo's naval staff had been destroyed by shell fire. Supplies were gone. Water was running out. Most soldiers were starving, surviving on roots and captured rations. Still, they fought on. Every night, small groups launched suicidal raids into Marine lines, hoping to kill before dawn took them. On June 27th, American forces reached Mount Tapocho, the highest point on Saipan. From its summit, they could see the entire island. Smoke rose from every valley. The sea glittered with the wreckage of ships. For the first time, the U.S. flag flew above central Saipan. Below, the surviving Japanese troops retreated north toward the cliffs of Marpi Point, the island's final refuge. Among them were thousands of civilians, farmers, families, women, and children, herded by soldiers into the mountains. The Japanese High Command knew the end had come, but surrender was not an option. The code of Gyokusai, honorable death, demanded that no one be taken alive. To surrender was to bring shame upon one's ancestors. On July 6th, Saito gathered his remaining officers. His voice was calm. "The fate of the empire depends on this battle. Each man must kill 10 enemies before dying." The next day, he led what would become one of the largest banzai charges of the Pacific War. Before dawn, nearly 3,000 wounded, starving, and desperate soldiers assembled in silence. Some had no rifles, carrying only bayonets or sticks. Others tied grenades to their belts. Behind them, medics and wounded men dragged themselves into line. Then, as the sun began to rise, they screamed in unison, a cry that rolled across the island like thunder. They charged straight into the American lines. The impact was devastating. Entire Marine positions were overrun. Trucks and tanks were engulfed in human waves. Some soldiers fought until they were physically crushed by bodies. It took hours and thousands of bullets to stop them. When the gunfire finally fell silent, more than 4,000 Japanese soldiers lay dead. The American 105th Regiment lost nearly 1,000 men, one of the costliest single engagements of the Pacific Campaign. General Saito, gravely wounded, performed ritual suicide with his sword. Admiral Nagumo followed soon after, using his pistol. By July 9th, organized Japanese resistance had ceased. Saipan was declared secure. But victory had come at a staggering cost. Over 3,400 Americans were dead, 10,000 wounded. More than 29,000 Japanese soldiers had been killed, and thousands of civilians were missing. The cliffs at the northern tip of Saipan would soon reveal why. The gunfire had stopped, but Saipan was not silent. In the days after the final banzai charge, American soldiers advancing north found a landscape of ruins, fields blackened by napalm, bunkers filled with the dead. The smell of decay hung over the island like fog. And then they reached the cliffs. At the northern tip of Saipan, the ground fell away into the Pacific. Sheer limestone walls dropping hundreds of feet to the sea. The Japanese called them Banzai Cliff and Suicide Cliff. To the Americans, they would become symbols of a tragedy they could not stop. Thousands of Japanese civilians had fled here. Farmers, mothers, children, the elderly, driven by fear and propaganda. For weeks, they had heard radio broadcasts and leaflets from the Imperial Army, warning that the Americans would slaughter anyone captured. "They will torture you," the soldiers told them. "They will take your women. And so, when the Americans arrived offering food and safety, many refused to believe it. They saw the leaflets as a trick, the loudspeakers as deception. U.S. Marines tried everything. They shouted through megaphones in Japanese. They sent captured interpreters forward. They brought food, medicine, even water. But on the cliffs, families gathered, weeping. Some held hands. Some prayed. Many carried grenades. The first explosions echoed through the morning haze. Then, the cries. Witnesses later recalled seeing entire groups walk calmly to the edge, bow, and fall together. Mothers threw children into the sea before leaping after them. American soldiers, horrified, tried to intervene, running to catch survivors, setting up nets below, pleading for them to stop. But the fear ran too deep. The Imperial Army had planted the belief that capture meant dishonor worse than death. It was the final order fulfilled. The beautiful death General Saito had promised. By the time it ended, over 1,000 civilians had perished at the cliffs. Some historians believe the number was far higher, perhaps double. The sea below turned dark with debris and bodies, photographs taken in the aftermath, women clutching infants, families lying side by side, became among the most haunting images of the Pacific War. For the Americans, Saipan was a military triumph, but no one on that island celebrated. Soldiers stood in silence, watching the surf crash against the rocks, knowing they had just witnessed something beyond war, a human collapse born of fear and indoctrination. When news of Saipan reached Tokyo, the shock was immediate and total. For the first time, the Japanese people realized the war was no longer distant. The outer defense line had been broken, and the enemy was now within bombing range of their homeland. American engineers wasted no time. Within weeks, B-29 bombers began operating from the new Isley and Kobler fields. From Saipan, they could reach Tokyo, Osaka, and Nagoya, the industrial heart of Japan. The psychological blow was devastating. Prime Minister Hideki Tojo, the man who had led Japan into war, faced mounting criticism from within his own government. The loss of Saipan proved that the Imperial Army could no longer protect the Emperor's realm. On July 18, 1944, Tojo resigned, along with his entire cabinet. Japan had not only lost an island, it had lost faith in its leadership. For the United States, Saipan opened the door to the final phase of the Pacific War. The Mariana Islands, Saipan, Tinian, and Guam would soon become the launching ground for an aerial offensive, unlike anything the world had ever seen. But for those who survived on Saipan, soldiers and civilians alike, victory and defeat were meaningless words. The war had consumed everything: families, homes, entire generations. The island that once bloomed with sugarcane now lay silent beneath black smoke and ash. And far below the cliffs, the Pacific rolled endlessly, carrying with it the echoes of that silence, the cries of those who chose death over surrender. Saipan's fall was more than a battle lost. It was the moment the empire began to crumble from within. In Tokyo, news of the island's capture spread like wildfire. The government tried to hide it, issuing vague statements about a temporary setback, but the truth seeped through. Civilians saw the faces of returning soldiers, exhausted, wounded, broken, and realized the myth of Japanese invincibility had died in the Marianas. For the Imperial High Command, the strategic consequences were catastrophic. Saipan's airfields now gave the Americans what they had long sought: a direct bridge to Japan's heartland. Within weeks, U.S. Navy Seabees transformed the island into a fortress of steel and concrete. Runways stretched across the coral plains where sugarcane once grew. B-29 superfortresses, the largest bombers ever built. began to arrive in shimmering formations, their wings casting shadows across the ruins. Each aircraft carried 10 tons of bombs and could fly over 3,000 miles. From Saipan, that meant Tokyo was just hours away. By November 1944, the first bombing missions began. Hundreds of B-29s rose into the night sky, their engines shaking the island. Below, Marines who had survived the battle watched silently as the planes vanished toward Japan, carrying fire instead of soldiers. When those bombers returned, they brought stories of entire cities burning: Tokyo, Nagoya, Kobe, Osaka. Each mission erased another piece of the empire. Civilians dug through rubble. Temples and homes became ashes. Saipan had become the launch pad for destruction on a scale the world had never witnessed. For Japan's military planners, the loss of Saipan was a death sentence. Without it, their defensive ring collapsed. The fall of Guam and Tinian soon followed, and by early 1945, American forces were closing in on Iwo Jima and Okinawa, the final steps before invasion. Inside the imperial palace, Emperor Hirohito began to question his generals for the first time. Accounts from post-war testimonies reveal that Saipan deeply disturbed him. He asked quietly, "If our defenses cannot protect the Marianas, how will they protect the home islands?" No one could answer. Meanwhile, on the other side of the Pacific, U.S. strategists gathered maps and calculations. From Saipan and Tinian, they planned an operation that would end the war and redefine humanity's future. On July 26, 1945, from these very islands, the U.S. issued the Potsdam Declaration, demanding Japan's unconditional surrender. Tokyo refused. 2 weeks later, on August 6th, a single B-29 Enola Gay lifted off from Tinian, only a few miles south of Saipan. Its mission was simple and final. When it returned, Hiroshima no longer existed. 3 days later, Nagasaki followed. Saipan, silent beneath the same sky, became the forgotten threshold between conventional war and atomic fire. In the years that followed, the island changed. Airfields became overgrown, rusting tanks sank into the jungle, but the cliffs remained untouched. Memorials carved by wind and time. Visitors still come there. Americans, Japanese, Chamorros, standing in silence above the waves. Some leave flowers, others prayers. Many do not speak at all. For the Japanese who survived, Saipan became a wound that never closed. It symbolized not only defeat, but the moment when their soldiers and their people were consumed by the ideology of death before surrender. For the Americans, it marked the beginning of victory, but also the threshold of a new kind of warfare, one where industrial power and human cost were inseparable. And for the world, Saipan was a warning that total war devours not only armies, but nations, beliefs, and souls. As historians later wrote, the tide that rose at Saipan did not stop until it washed upon the shores of Hiroshima. The Pacific still glitters around those cliffs, calm, vast, and endless. But beneath its waves lie the echoes of ships, soldiers, and civilians whose last moments vanished into the horizon. The same horizon where Japanese soldiers once stood in silence, watching the sea turn black with ships, knowing their world was ending. History remembers Saipan as a victory, but victories are measured in silence, not in cheers, not in flags, but in the spaces left behind when the guns stop. On that small island in the middle of the Pacific, tens of thousands died for a cause that was already lost. Soldiers fought not for territory, but for ideals, duty, honor, loyalty, words that meant different things on each side of the battle, yet carried the same weight in death. For the Japanese, Saipan was the shattering of a belief. that sacrifice could outlast strategy, that spirit could triumph over steel. For the Americans, it was a reminder that even triumph carries the smell of ash. When the sun sets over the cliffs today, the sea is still. The wind carries no sound of war, only the faint rustle of grass over the bunkers and the crash of waves below. Yet, for those who stand there, whether soldier, pilgrim, or historian, the silence speaks louder than any monument. It tells of a time when courage and tragedy were inseparable, when men chose death over surrender, and others fought through fire to survive. It tells of a generation that witnessed the end of one world and the birth of another, the dawn of atomic warfare, and the shadow it cast over all humanity. Saipan was not just a battle. It was a turning point, the moment the Pacific War became total, when the will to win overcame the will to live. And in its aftermath, both nations began to understand the same truth, that no victory is pure, and no defeat absolute. The ocean that once carried warships now carries memories. The horizon that once brought terror now brings light. And somewhere in that distance, beyond the sound of waves, beyond history's reach, remain the echoes of men who cried in silence, watching the sea turn black, knowing that everything they had ever known was drifting away with the tide.